Hey, everybody, let's do this thing.
2, 3, 4.
All right, everybody, this is probably the last law school-ish stream of at least this semester. This is me live reading my Rule of Law seminar paper, and it's helping you to know what the hell happens in law school, and it's helping me because I'm going to read it out loud, and if there's any crazy grammar shit that shouldn't be there, I should be able to figure it out and correct it before I submit it to the professor. Moderator, where are you at? Moderator, you're a terrible person. Yeah, there you are. Yeah, late as usual. All right. Here's the table of contents. Look at that whole table of contents. Isn't it cute? It's the table of contents. Introduction. In Act 2, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark refers to the town's theater company as the abstract and brief chronicles of the time. Moments later, he advises Polonius, "You were better have a bad epitaph after your death than their ill report while you live." Hamlet's general proposition that theatrical productions, because they emerge from and reflect back on the moment in time during which they were written and performed, provide a historical lens. In fact, as plays and theatrical productions are created in media res of their historical moment, not pieced together post hoc as official histories, they provide a much more authentic, boots on the ground account of cultural and national consciences. As such, both the plot of Hamlet and the political/philosophical commentaries it forwards have their foils in 1601 England. The origin of the rule of law and legitimacy of sovereign authority are foremost among those themes appearing center stage in Shakespeare's production. Both were also the contested objectives of warring factions in 1601 English society. The battle for legal authority. Oh, there we go. My camera is weird. Both were the contested objectives of warring factions in 1601 English society. The battle for legal authority in England between custom and statute was no stranger to Shakespeare's stage. In 1600, on the eve of the Essex Rebellion, the principal co-conspirators in that rebellion. Oh, that's weird. Sorry, buddy. The comma should be there. The principal co-conspirators in that rebellion met at Shakespeare's Swan Theatre. They took in a special production of Richard III, which cast, clothed, and enacted its titular villain as Robert Lord Cecil. Oh, it was William. That's weird. Well, I caught that. As William Lord Cecil, the present Queen Elizabeth Lord Chancellor, the master of revels, and the principal target for assassination the following morning. In addition to the overt political themes this production put forth on stage, the players had a bit of personal bone to pick with this particular Lord Chancellor. As master of the revels, he had been responsible for censuring a number of this acting group's, Ben Jonson's, and Kit Marlowe's plays on the basis of their overt political discourses, period. To be certain, as Hamlet, the play, was being born in its author's mind, Shakespeare's thoughts were pregnant with the political zeitgeist of the time. As a brief roadmap, this essay will begin with a discussion of the two battling notions of the rule of law warring in England at the turn of the 17th century. The first being the long-held notion that the authority of law ultimately came not from who conceived it, but by the people adopting it through its integration into their cultural practice. The latter being the turn to the Hobbesian/Benthamite idea of governance, which was blossoming in the late Elizabethan years, but came to full bloom in the Jacobean period. This essay will then briefly discuss how Hamlet the play necessarily treats these warring ideologies. Next, this essay will discuss how the battleground involving these strange bedfellows from American perspective of church and state play out on that stage through the theatrical archetype of the fool in Hamlet the play. Finally, this essay will discuss how this odd couple, church and state, were able to avert the disaster predicted in the gravedigger scene of Hamlet through the pairing of the old authority of religion and the new need for stability of culture and practice in the Elizabethan and Jacobean England. Part 2. Virtue and the Transcendent, the cultural embodiments of the law. As legal historian Walter Ullman, I'm sorry, Walter, there's two N's in your name. Ullman argues the source of legal authority in England has long been held, predating the Tudor family's ascension to power. To derive its power and authority from the Tacitus Consensus Populi. The authority of a law thus ultimately came not from who conceived it, but by the people adopting it through an assimilative process, integrating it into the culture. Thus, the authority a law would have over the people adopting it would be much more a matter of the people's concession to its rightness and authority by adopting it into custom than when or by whom it was thought up. The competing notion which came to the fore during the reign of Elizabeth, and even more so under James in the early 1600s, was that the authority of a monarch came from expressis consensus populi, or the express consent of the people in recognizing a monarch to be governed by whatever rules or regulations were promulgated at that monarch's will. These sorts of tactics would later be espoused by the Benthamite school of English political theory. However, at the time, they were favored by Lord Cecil and other proponents of the Star Chamber, who placed an extreme focus on the origin of such practices being the will of the monarch. This, in turn, de-emphasized the perspective that legal authority arose from the culture and custom and owed its legitimacy to the same. Regardless, a fundamental shift occurred between these two perspectives concerning the rule of law. The former, which emphasizes the duration of time since a rule has been promulgated as the course of its legitimacy, and the latter, that cares solely about the source of the promulgation for the determination of its legitimacy. The former of these perspectives considers the strength given to a rule by time. This duration in time is not essential to the introduction of a custom, but for the formalization of society's consent to be ruled by it. It is precisely this discourse that Hamlet the play enters into. Lol. Section 3. Gravediggers, PLC, Attorneys at Law. Historian Walter Ullman argues that English society experienced a fundamental shift in the social understanding of legal authority during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. This shift reached its apotheosis in the Benthamites' constructivist view of history and positivist social philosophy. However, this branch of thought, good God, thank the Lord, had not fully taken root in 1600. During Elizabeth's reign, a statute or a sovereign act did not carry the assumption of legitimacy and status as a binding rule upon all Englishmen at the moment of promulgation. The legitimacy of statutory constructs held a similar status as rules arising from religious, cultural, and customary practices. As a matter of social reality, the process by which a statute came to be recognized as legitimate involved its persistent presence in public life. This process of tacit social adoption and legitimation manifests in a rules incorporation in the daily practices across the diverse strata of English society. The coherence and consistency this provided lent stability to a nation facing numerous external threats. Still, the general manner with which the legitimacy of authority was perceived by the masses came from the feeling that even though a sovereign may pass a statute or make a proclamation, the social realities of most people being ruled by the laws promulgated by the previous generation of rulers. This afforded the population of any given community a sufficient period for the dictates promulgated by the sovereign to trickle down and be assimilated as part of the individual daily activities of the people more broadly. The notion of statutory limitations on certain individual activities or the prescription of others as taking effect from the moment of its promulgation was a foreign concept to the people in English people in Shakespeare's time. Rather, the weight of a dictate or statute's perceived legitimacy had a similar standing to the normative, traditional social behaviors arising from culture and custom. Both owe their legitimacy to the same adoption and enactment into the sphere of public life of a community. The view that a statute represents the express will of the sovereign is de facto adopted and is de facto adopted legitimately at the time of its issuance did not exist in 1600. Act 4, Scene 5 of Hamlet dramatizes the social perception of rules promulgated hastily by the sovereign through proclamation or statute, lowercase sovereign. The Gravedigger's dialogue elucidates how legitimacy suffers when inconsistent rules emerge from the ether, which break drastically with the tradition, custom, and right reason. The Gravedigger's dialogue reveals their present activities' departure from custom and natural law. As they dig a grave for Ophelia, both doubt the propriety of giving a Christian burial to one that willfully seeks her own salvation. Means Ophelia sushi slided herself. Both gravediggers stand for the proposition that Ophelia's sushi slide as a sin of despair requires, by Christian tradition and custom, the burial be in unsanctified ground. Yet, the king's self-serving plan to hide the suspicious and questionable circumstances of Ophelia's death from the public eye override the moral or religious consideration expected by even the lowest rungs of society, i.e., the gravediggers. The gravediggers consider how this proclamation can possibly be consistent with natural law and local custom by applying basic reason. Ophelia drowned herself and is to receive a Christian burial, which cannot be, quote, unless she drowned herself in her own defense. The basic principles of common sense as imbibed by the gravediggers are rankly offended by this violation of the localized perception of the rule of law upon the whim of the king. The first gravedigger's response pokes fun at both the violation of custom and a violation of custom. I think it should be as based upon the king's spoken command and the freewheeling manner through which it was promulgated. When the first gravedigger says, quote, because they did find it so, it must be sea offendendo, it cannot be else. He pronounces a curious phrase, one that rings of a Latin legal sounding authority, but is actually a demotic early modern English phrase, meaning if you say it often enough, it will become true. Sea offendendo is what I'm talking about. Sea offendendo means if you say it often enough, it'll become true, but it's not Latin, though it sounds like Latin, right? But despite such the humor and drive home the point, the second gravedigger asks, is this good law? The first gravedigger answers and assures him that it is coroner's quest law, with the implication being that the king sent the coroner who pronounced Ophelia's death on a quest for any reason under the sun to give her a Christian burial, and he dubiously obliged. The pseudo-legal status of the king's decree, as portrayed by the gravediggers, and its laughable perversion of the local expectations of custom and culture show the cloud that such an act by a sovereign would be placed over the legitimacy of decrees promulgated in this way. This becomes particularly relevant when considering the archetypal figures which the gravediggers represent in Shakespeare's theater and for English society at the time. Part 4. The Fools, Custom, Statute, and the Formalization of Consent. The gravediggers in Hamlet serve a traditional dramatic purpose. They both play the fool. The fool is an archetype in theater, began in Roman drama. The fool always represents the socially disaffected. The fool is a member of the lowest social class, a slave, a swineherd, a gravedigger. These occupations, the least desirable in society, draw scorn even from serfs and farmers. They represent an assigned station in life. Society allows these fellows neither advancement out of such a role nor any regard for those who hold it. The fool's representation of an individual from one of those untouchable classes thus allows him to speak truth even about the sovereign, even about the royals, the monarchs, about anybody. The fool may always criticize the ruling class with impunity, as there is no indignity left for him to endure. In this context, the gravedigger's elaboration of the inconsistencies between the king's decree and right reason addresses, from a social perspective, the failure of the king's will, as a sheer act of will, to formalize the consent of the common people in terms of their promulgation. Well, let's just say act. The king's act. Thank you. Thank you, Jesus. The legitimacy of the sovereign proclamations, statutes, or rules as binding on society as they are promulgated depends upon the public's perception of the legitimacy and the extent to which they break with the common understanding of the prescribed cultural, traditional, and religious practices. The fool, in Elizabethan theater, is the lowest of the low in societal terms. He has no position or title to lose. No expectations of propriety or civility govern the fool's speech on the stage. Rather, the fool's peak. Oh, the fool speaks, not peaks. He doesn't speak. He doesn't peak. He speaks. The fool speaks freely and expresses the mind of the people, the conscience of society. Only the fool can profess social truths without any fear of retaliation, because, plainly, he has nothing to lose. Scholars, historians, and political theorists concur that those opinions which are too subversive to speak aloud in the street are placed in the fool's mouth on the stage. Accordingly, the gravedigger's conversation addresses the most serious and moral social issues raised by Hamlet, the play. Here, the gravediggers present the argument for rule by natural law as determined by right reason. As Aquinas notes, Thomas Aquinas, the old theologian, and Shakespeare was well aware of, in order to retain some force of natural law, human laws must be derived from the premises of natural law and through the application of right reason. Thus, reason properly deployed can reveal inconsistencies between the laws of man and natural law, casting doubt on the legitimacy and authority of statute, which is definitionally a law of man. Here, to adjudicate the circumstances of Ophelia's death and the potential implications for their involvement in her interment, the gravediggers perform what can only be called properly a legal analysis. The traditional English defense to a charge of homicide predating 1600 is self-defense. Homicide, the taking of a life, and suicide slide differ legally only as to who is the victim of the action. Thus, suicide slide could be justifiable and not a mortal sin under a theory of self-defense. A Christian burial would therefore never be proper unless the deceased, here from a sushi slide, either unintentionally took their own life somehow or took their own life in self-defense. However, as one must intentionally act to defend oneself, that act must always be done wittingly. As the first gravedigger announces, self-defense, quote, argues an act, and an act have three branches. It is to act, to do, and to perform. Testing this legal definition of an act, the gravedigger constructs a hypothetical. He says, here lies the water. There stands the man. If the man goes to the water and drowns, it is willy-nilly he goes. Also, just for a note, the whole phrase willy-nilly, Shakespeare created it in this scene of Hamlet. Like, Shakespeare made that shit up. And it's now willy-nilly. It means like by will he goes. So willy-nilly he goes. Anyways, rationally, this analysis works to define an intentional act using the premises derived from natural law. The action performed by the man brings him to the water to drown. Conversely, the gravedigger says, if the man stands here and the water comes to the man, he drowns not himself. The logical progression leads the gravedigger to his logical conclusion. She who is not guilty of her own death shortens not her own life. Ophelia, for people who don't remember, drowned herself in a pond. In the case of Ophelia, beginning at premises based in natural law and applying right reason exclude all circumstances warranting any kind of Christian burial. The fact that she is to be given one sets the authority of the king at odds with traditional morality, natural law, social custom, and right reason. The obvious fact that all the exigency for this new rule lays in the self-serving desire of the king to avoid social criticism violates even the wildly constructivist justifications, such as promoting the social good or balancing social interests. The gravedigger's dialogue thus shows us several important factors of how the English common folk viewed the formalization of consent to rules promulgated by the sovereign alone and enacted in a blatantly self-serving manner. To review, the gravedigger's rudimentary logical analysis makes a social statement that no one is being fooled by the illegitimate promulgations of the sovereign, even if passed off as legitimate, even the fools. The gravedigger's analysis further drives home the point that Ophelia drowning herself in the pond constitutes an intentional act. This intentional act is an act of self-slaughter, and the offense is thus both against the law of man, as it were, and even more so against the law of nature, the transcendent law. The second gravedigger, the less clever of the pair, but still an astute observer of the social conditions around him, says the quiet part out loud, quote, if she had not been a gentlewoman, she would have been buried out of Christian burial. End quote. This is the most plain statement in the entire play as to why the acts of the new sovereign, the new King Claudius, cannot be ratified by the acceptance of the common people despite their promulgator, the king. Plainly put, the disproportionate treatment of individuals, even after they've been shuffled loose of their mortal coil, based on their special status and really their value to the present king's political machinations, so shocks the conscience that the everyman, that even the lowest of the low, the fools, the gravediggers, recoil at it. The first gravedigger, who has spent the scene unearthing as many bones as he has sound legal theories to clear the space for Ophelia to be buried, replies in a much more sardonic tone to his fellow gravedigger. His reply makes a fine point of the issues of legitimacy for the rule of law as arising from the consent of society, and adds a little panache to the more plain-spoken words of his partner in toil. Quote, "Why thou sayest it, and more the pity, that great folks should have countenance in this world, to drown or hang themselves more than they're even Christian." The statement drives home that the necessary social consent for the adoption of a rule promulgated by the monarch cannot be abrogated by the source of that promulgation alone. Moreover, it furthers the argument in the scene. Some more socially radical scholars have read this argument as a strictly class-based indictment of the privileged class for throwing their social weight around. However, a closer reading of these lines reveals that, as oft happens in the Bard's works, Shakespeare with the Bard, right, a deeper social critique which fundamentally touches on the exists. Wow. Exist. Whoa. Which fundamentally touches on the rule of law. Good. The notion that the beautiful people, the gentry, have greater privileges in all aspects of life than the common folk presents what may be considered a near tautology. Of course, the beautiful people, the Kardashians, the Ophelias, the Poloniuses, the Claudiuses, the Hamlets, they all have, more privilege in life than us common folk do. However, the scene works that principle even further. The principal critique is not that class of privilege innately grants one additional rights in a vacuum. The thrust of the critique from the perspective of the Tacitus consensus populi is that the rule made by a sovereign decree runs directly afoul of the expected social and traditional norms the people of a nation or Denmark or England or this nation would expect. It is also a matter of dramatic irony that the diametric opposition of the Christian national identity and the social status of individuals within the hierarchy of that nation are played off of each other. To state the argument plainly, the first gravedigger is saying that the real shame here lies in the socially recognized identity of someone as a noble supersedes their identity as a Christian. To frame this argument in a strictly legal context, being a noble grants one some super special legal rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the right to hang or drown oneself without facing any theological consequences. The primary issue with this, and the critique the gravedigger's colloquy highlights, is that it places the rules at law promulgated by the sovereign far above the natural law, which is both discernible by right reason and passed down through the traditional, cultural, and historical heritage of local Christian communities. The gravediggers of actual England at the time of Hamlet's drafting, the true common folk of Elizabethan England, had grave social concerns. Foremost among them was how does Elizabeth or James in the very near future land a plane that has the gremlin of aristocracy and the privilege of promulgating statutory law, taking a hammer to the engine mounted on one wing, and the gremlin of traditional local culture and history taking a hammer to the engine mounted on the opposite wing, pull the plane out of its proverbial nosedive. In order to resolve this question, it is necessary to acknowledge that Elizabeth England, in fact, landed this plane. It is also necessary for the proper examination of how precisely this was accomplished, or, to put it another way, how the critique of the gravediggers was adequately responded to in early 17th century England. To cast aside any present-day preconceptions American or English audience may have, well, that's a long... whatever. I'll finish it later. Case any present-day preconceptions American or English audiences may have regarding the separation of church and state. All right, hang on. Conclusion. Only like 3 pages left. Like, just drink. You'll refresh the refresh the mind, the spirit, and also the lungs. All right. All right. Conclusion. With the old authority and the new culture, this article began with a brief introduction to the social milieu and historical zeitgeist of the period during which Shakespeare drafted Hamlet, and during which the play was initially performed. T.S. Eliot, the leading founder of the new critical school of social, religious, and philosophical thought in the early 20th century, provides a deep theory and commentary on the rule of law in Elizabethan England and how foreign the conceptual realities that preserved England in those times are to modern man. In March of 1939 at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, T.S. Eliot delivered a series of 3 lectures titled The Idea of a Christian Society. Eliot argued that the system of human affairs is fundamentally incompatible with right reason, human virtue, and social practice. He continues that politicians appeal to practical reason, falter, and testify only for themselves with new relativistic vocabularies. The so-called superstitions of ancient wisdom, local culture, and ancestral heritage have decayed. As each has fallen, society has grown too familiar with the idea that their laws and institutions are not products of wisdom and virtue, but arise from corruption grafted upon the most base and hedonistic barbarism. The iniquitous and unworkable system ameliorates the interest any conscious thinking person must pursue to understand the society in which he lives. Eliot argues that this was not the case in early modern England. This theory can reconcile the social concerns enacted in Hamlet and the historical reality of late Tudor England. Eliot strongly contended that contemporary political issues of church and state, as well as those influencing England during the reign of Elizabeth, are not properly considered if read through an American constitutional statutory framework or in the view of the English common law tradition. Rather, Elizabeth's and England's success in unifying the country and staving off civil war, regicide, and foreign aggression was largely due to concerted efforts of Bishop Lancelot Andrewes, believe it or not, within the Church of England. Moreover, this unification was deeply reliant on the deployment of localized, culturally, and historically embedded natural law. This conception of the law, which was advocated for by the gravediggers in Hamlet, bound individuals to ethically regard the maintenance of the social relationships and common objectives of their communities and as innately virtuous. These associations between families, rectors, and guildsmen sprung from the local parishes to form an organic social order that was resilient to both international or internal sectarian strife and the fear of foreign aggression. Essentially, the maintenance of these local communities created a firewall of historic and customary protection in the minds of their community members from abstract threats of violence, inherent in both anarchy and in tyranny. Lancelot Andrewes knew exactly how to leverage these cultural elements of natural law and historical tradition to build further social cohesion through fostering a local sense of community through faith. And, well, Andrews. Yeah, okay, sorry. What? I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, figure out though. Anyways, for some reason, Andrews' name wants to be weird. All right, we'll get back there. 1 second. Oh, this is right. Oh, he's just got a weird English spelling of Andrews. Fair enough. All right. Andrews perceived the tension. Okay. Yeah. New natural natural cohesion through focusing local sense of community through faith. Andrews perceived the tension which political and cultural divisions had fostered in early 17th century England. He also saw the political and dynastic factions ascribing religious motivation to their every action and the corrosive effects this had on existing close-knit community bonds and values. When regicide, that's like killing a king or a queen, failed in both 1599 and 1600, Andrews decided to respond. He swiftly and strictly limited sermons' potential topics. Though, as Eliot astutely pronounced a century ago, this may sound insane to the present audience. The careful consideration of which topics local priests should broach in their Sunday sermons had a greater effect on the cultural integrity of 1600 England than any notion of jurisprudence or political policy recognized in America today. Andrews also practiced what he preached. Haha, get it? Lancelot Andrews gave 23 Christmas Day sermons to Elizabeth and James, Queen Elizabeth, and to King James, many of which are recorded, not on audio or video. Obviously, it was 1603, so by writing them down, and thus promulgated to the local directors and parish priests across the hinterlands. Andrew's sermons, like those given before King James between 1605 and 1624, focused solely upon the incarnation, and each contained similar essential points of Christian dogma. Andrews never went into any more problematic, nuanced, or divisive elements of Christian, Catholic, or Anglican beliefs, but managed to provide 17 unique, fundamentally unifying perspectives of what the incarnation meant for the everyday Englishman. Moreover, he made his language even more common and easily understandable to both the local parishioner and the local priest. Through this process, Andrews urged instruction and restraint on the part of the ecclesiastical leadership and the local clergy. Instead of discussing predetermination or the See of Rome or indulgences or other matters of contention and division, Andrews That's the issue. That's what screwed me up. He has an S on his name, so he should be that. Okay. Andrews, pastors, bishops, and archbishops went to their churches and spoke on the incarnation, the Trinity, and the importance of redemption and the fallibility, and the fallibility of human nature. By this traditional, cultural, non-political messaging, even within a very politicized body, 16th century England or 1600 England, right? These sermons allowed the people of England to cohere into a unified body. Should say, see, this is why I'm doing this. Body, the body of the church. Cool. Eliot argues that this feat was accomplished by Bishop Lancelot Andrews, speaking sermons with the old authority and to the new culture. Andrews, Eliot argues, was the first great preacher of the English Catholic Church. That might sound weird to you out there, but listen. By the English Catholic Church, Eliot means a church that only existed for a very brief period of time, but was able to do what political machinations, sovereign promulgations, and natural foreign policy could not accomplish. This unification movement, in essence, was a response to the gravedigger's critique in Hamlet of early 17th century English society, that whatever rule a sovereign may be promulgating, it has its core effect only to the extent it is assimilable within the existing moral and cultural superstructure. So, for everyone out there, the word Catholic, not applying to religion exactly, right, means unified, one, unitary, right? So when the English Catholic Church, what Eliot's talking about is that there was a brief moment between Elizabeth and James's reign when the Church of England became unified in this kind of common Christian sense, right? So with Catholic, not in that it said the Pope was the leader, but then it was a unified body of religious believers. So that's where that's at. Because the essential role of the parish priest as a leader of the parish was to educate his people in the essential, everyday, necessary elements of belief, it was incumbent on him to teach every Englishman to value virtue. This instruction was for the purpose of helping the local people function as a community. It was not to be a device for the advancement of any individual's pet cause, nor a stage upon which to score political points or push for higher ecclesiastical office. Thus, Andrews' priests and bishops took heed. They authored and delivered sermons specifically intended to eliminate sectarian friction. These sermons eschewed purporting on which faction is right or wrong in a dogmatic dispute. Rather, these messages were promulgated to teach and expand upon the something in common, something culturally coherent, something that applied to all the audience and to all the country. It is this essential humility, this humbleness, and this knowing one's position and role as a part of a local community, motivated by right reason and an understanding of virtue, that saved Elizabeth England from the sort of cultural crisis the grave diggers in Hamlet predicted. However, it is essential for us living today to recognize the lesson this should teach. The essential element to the rule of law lies in the local life of each community and how well and by what mechanisms it is that community by what mechanisms is that community oriented towards something higher than its own material benefit. The end. And 89 footnotes. Yay, bread. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in and helping with my paper. You all have a blessed one and take care. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.